And now we continue the series of 6 programmes presented by Monty Haltrecht, which is called Enjoying Opera. Programme 5, Words and Music.
Much of Italy was under Austrian rule when Verdi was born, and several of his operas, with their conspiracies, assassinations and fervent choruses, were liable to be seen as metaphors for the overthrow of government. That chorus from Nabucco, the Hebrews in exile lamenting their lost homeland, was also taken to represent the Italians under a foreign yoke, yearning for freedom. Sometimes the censors insisted Verdi change the story, even transfer it to a totally different setting, and that upset him greatly, because he took story very seriously. The transposition of a scene, or even of one number, he wrote angrily, almost always leads to failure. Imagine what happens when they change the plot. It's as though someone had placed a black band across the nose of one of your beautiful statues. The story in opera is important. That's where opera begins. Take Il Trovatore, another Verdi opera. Its story has become something of a byword for silliness. But on the other hand, it does provide those conflicts and dramatic situations which Verdi needed. In this scene, a half-crazed gypsy woman is recalling how, long ago, her mother was burnt at the stake as a witch, and by way of revenge, she stole her enemy's baby son and threw him into the flames too. Only, and this is what the plot hinges on, the one she'd thrown in was her own. Silly if you like. But listen to what Verdi makes of it. Fiorenza Cosotto in Verdi's Il Trovatore. Trovatore was based on a Spanish play and set in late medieval Spain. It had the kind of richly melodramatic plot mid-19th century audiences revelled in. Obviously Verdi revelled in it too. And at least for opera, American baritone Cheryl Milnes finds such stories perfectly acceptable.
They are odd stories, and yet if somebody is emotionally attuned to the music, it's there, the raw gut reaction stuff. Whether you know that a letter was passed or a baby was thrown in, if you don't know what's going on word by word, I don't know that it's absolutely necessary to know all those things, because you're not going to hear them. You're going to hear fear and rage and anger and love and frustration and the basic human emotions. That's what you're going to hear. That's what Verdi wrote primarily about.
Cheryl Milnes with Leontine Price in Verdi's Il Trovatore. He triumphing because he thinks she's going to yield to him, but she actually planning to thwart his foul designs by taking poison at the crucial moment. Stories in opera are sometimes a little far-fetched. But as we heard in an earlier programme, these can embody archetypal fantasies and touch on essential dreams and preoccupations. Il Trovatore contains a very touching mother-son relationship between the gypsy and the baby she didn't throw on the fire but brought up as her own instead. And there is archetypal male rivalry between that adopted son and the villain of the piece, the part you heard Cheryl Milnes sing just now, who are both in love with the same woman. You find far-fetched stories in the Bible, and in Shakespeare too, and in their context these too can work very well. But some people do find some of the stories a barrier, and the fact that so many operas are also in a foreign language can make things worse. Translation is the obvious way to surmount that one, but it's a very vexed and very much discussed question in opera, translation as against the original language. There are gains, there are losses too. Maybe you'd rather not follow the words of some operas all that closely, or indeed of any operas.
I have a friend in New York who complained bitterly about the New York City Opera switching from Italian to English in one of their productions. I've forgotten which it was. Could have been Bohème. But she said she used to go and sit there and enjoy the music and have it sort of break over her in waves, and she didn't feel that she really had to pay attention. And when it was in English, she thought she had to. And it disturbed her because she really didn't hear the music anymore. She just heard the words, and she was listening for the words. And that can be a problem.
Soprano Marilyn Shaw. Many hands will be raised in horror at that attitude, but there's no dictating to people how they should or should not enjoy themselves. At one time, a century or so ago, a place like Covent Garden would give all its operas, the French and German ones too, in Italian. But sometimes the language doesn't seem to matter. Whether you can understand it or not doesn't seem to matter. The singing is irresistible. Lenski's aria from Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin, sung there by Richard Tauber, not in the original Russian, but in his own native German. Mind you, it can sound pretty good in the original Russian too, if you've got a singer like Nikolai Gedda.
Благо, бдения и сна в приходе час определенный, благословен и день забот, благословен и тьмы.
You're never going to catch all the words, even if the opera is sung in your own language. That's the nature of opera. Words sung over an orchestra, particularly in ensembles, with other singers making different sounds at the same time, can be hard to pick up. And choruses too. There's a lovely story about the chorus in Gounod's Faust changing the words. They were singing in English, but they must have been very confident that they weren't going to be understood anyway, because what they actually sang was, "Up with her petticoats, down with her drawers, I'll show you my thing if you show me yours." A chorus from Gounod's Faust in the original French. Even if you're never going to catch all the words in an opera, in a good performance, the important ones ought to come across clearly, particularly if they're in your own language. But is English a good language to sing in? Certainly it is, at least according to Cheryl Milnes, who has no doubt about the principal benefit.
The gain in clarity, assuming that the cast sings with great clarity, and that's a whole nother problem. We tend to, or a lot of people will say, singing an opera in English is stupid because you can't understand the words anyway. And they blame the English language. Sometimes they're right. Operas in English, if you don't understand anything, well, then it's foolish. But that's not the fault of the language, it's the fault of the cast. We study how to sing all other languages. We rarely study how to sing our own.
Cheryl Milnes. Possibly some operas benefit more from translation than others. In an opera like Il Trovatore, as Cheryl Milnes suggested earlier, it's not so important to know what's going on word by word. But take Wagner, for example. There you have philosophical and poetic ideas, long scenes of argument, narrations, reflective and introspective passages. Robert Lloyd in Wagner's Parsifal, singing, of course, in the original German. Ravishing orchestration with highly seductive reverberations. Not much in the way of vocal melody if you compare it with Trovatore, but a wonderful harmony of voice and orchestra.
If you take an opera such as most of the Wagner operas, the text is extremely important there, because Wagner himself wrote the words and he conceived the music out of the words. And he was, I suppose, a poet and a philosopher as well as a musician. And the music needs all three ingredients. It needs the poet, it needs the philosopher, and it needs the musician. And sometimes you could argue that it would be better done in the language of the people who are listening.
Robert Lloyd. Covent Garden's German language coach, Hilda Beale, is naturally particularly sensitive to the problems of operatic translation, and she gives an example.
Talking of translations, it's quite impossible, I think, to translate beautifully. The beginning of Rheingold. In Rheingold, you get words like Vaja, Vaga, Woge du Welle, Walle zur Wiege, Vaga la Vaja, Walla la Vaja la Vaga. In Wellgunde ist es, Woglinde, wachst du allein? Mit Wellgunde wär ich zu zwei. They're all lovely, open, watery sounds. And later on, when they describe Alberich, they use completely different type of language. When they tease him and when they say how ugly he is, they say things like, Pfui, du haariger, höckriger Geck, schwarzes, schwieliges Schwefelgezwerg. They address him like that. And the language is quite different, and that, of course, is matched by the music. That's very hard to translate.
One of Wagner's Rhine maidens teasing the dwarf Alberich in a recording of a Bayreuth production conducted by Pierre Boulez. Hard to translate, as Hilda Beale says, but it can be done. Here's that same scene in Andrew Porter's translation from a recording by the English National Opera under Reginald Goodall. Maybe not quite so sharp and incisive as the original German, but an excellent approximation. There can be perhaps greater problems still translating some other languages. French, for example, has its own nasal sounds which you don't get in English, while Italian has so many words ending with open vowels. gelida. There's no way you can quite match in English che gelida manina from Puccini's La Bohème. It means literally, what a cold little hand, and it's usually translated as your tiny hand is frozen, because it's got to fit the rhythm da-da, da-da, da-da-da. One of the main arguments against translation is that all the major opera composers were sensitive to language. They matched their music carefully to the sounds of the original text, the particular vowels, long or short, the particular consonants, hard or soft. And inevitably, in translation, you sometimes get accent and emphasis falling on the wrong syllable, and a word might have to be distorted to fit the music, and you lose the authentic flavour. On the other hand, look what you gain. An entire Bayreuth production of The Ring under Boulez, you heard an excerpt just now, was recently shown on television. And certainly one of the reasons it captured large audiences was the subtitles, which enabled people to follow the action moment by moment. But again, just how much you lose if you can't follow varies from one kind of opera to another.
I think you lose more in comic operas, and you probably lose more in operas like Strauss, where the text is almost more important than the music in parts. Certainly in bits of Rosenkavalier and Arabella, Ariadne, Capriccio, the text is exquisite. And I think you're going to miss quite a lot if you don't understand at least some of the language. And the more you understand, the more you get out of them. I'm sometimes very sad when I sit in the theater and I think people are so funny and very few people in the audience laugh. Now that's very sad. They should laugh, and then I think perhaps we should be doing it in English.
Hilda Beale. Dame Janet Baker agrees. She sang opera in both the original language and translation, and she gives us the singer's viewpoint, as well as seeing it from the audience's point of view as well.
It's devastating for performers to sing comic opera and not get response. And I think there's a real case for singing any opera with a comic attitude in the language that people can understand. I've also been in audiences in Covent Garden listening to something as repertoire as the Rosenkavalier performances, when everybody gets the very obvious ham comedy, but even an audience like the Covent Garden audience doesn't appreciate the subtleties of that score because they don't know the German words well enough. They miss a great deal.
Here's a short scene from the opera both Janet Baker and Hilda Beale mention, Richard Strauss's Rosenkavalier. The comedy centres on a boorish provincial nobleman, Baron Ochs. Here, he's just frightened the convent-bred girl he's engaged to by his crude advances, and he's been slightly wounded by the young man who drew his sword in her defence. But he's soon restored to good humour. He even praises the girl for her spirit, while he calls for wine and a comfortable bed, making the most of his mishap. Listen to the way he points the word ein Federbett, a feather bed.
Ein Federbett. 2 Stunden noch bis Tisch. Wird's Zeit lang haben.
Kurt Böhmer as Baron Ochs in Richard Strauss's Rosenkavalier. A wonderfully sunny comic performance, and more wonderful still if you can understand the words he points with such relish. That sort of singing is almost conversational in style. By the beginning of this century, operatic techniques had so far developed that dialogue was often no longer separate from the musical numbers, and the music was continuous, one section flowing into another, as in Rosenkavalier. But in earlier comedies, like the operas of Rossini, or earlier still the Italian operas of Mozart, there the dialogue sounds like this.
Goodness, what can it be? Do not hunt, do not keep us in suspense.
You must have courage. Be prepared for a shock.
Oh, heavens, what happened to our fiancés? Are they in trouble? Is my Ferrando dead? Or my Guglielmo?
Dead! They are not, but Not much less than that.
In prison?
No,
Are they ill?
no.
What can it be then?
By royal order, they must leave for the front.
Oh dear, when do they leave?
At once.
And is there no way to exempt them?
No way.
And no goodbye?
Wretched fellows, they don't have the courage to face you. But if you both can bear it, I'll call them.
Please do.
Come in now, my hero.
An English language recording of Mozart's Così fan tutte with an American flavour.
Many operas, comedies, for instance, Rossini and Mozart things especially, can be very good in English. And often, as a first introduction, the first few years of a new audience, whoever those people would be, it can be very good for them to go to Marriage of Figaro in English, Barbara Seville in English. Absolutely works. There's nothing worse than for someone who doesn't know anything about opera to hear all the recitatives running by, which in fact in those operas is the story moving along. All of the set pieces are emotional outbursts. The story doesn't move. To hear pages and pages of recitatives and not have a clue as to what is going on, that's ridiculous.
Cheryl Milnes. But there can be problems with the dialogue even when you're performing comic opera in English. Suppose you're Robert Lloyd and you've been cast by Scottish Opera in Seraglio, which being one of Mozart's German operas has spoken dialogue without musical accompaniment. What kind of voice and accent do you use for the fat, fussy and ferocious Osmin, overseer of the Pasha's harem? Osmin's not an upper-class character, so an Oxford accent wouldn't be right. Is there a Glaswegian equivalent?
It was a little dilemma for me. And I decided to use the voice of a London policeman, which was something like, hello, 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 what's going on here then? And it went down a treat. And in fact, there was a moment at the end of the opera when Belmonte was just about to abduct Constanza. And I caught him carrying a ladder, and I had to say, ho, 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 what's all this? And on the last performance, I did in fact interpolate the line, hello, 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 what's going on here then? And afterwards, the stage manager, who was a very po-faced Scotsman, said to me, Mr. Lloyd, he said, when I was in rep, we used to fine people for interpolating lines. He said, but on this occasion, I'll give you 10 bob extra. The reaction from the audience was quite astonishing to that, which shows just how refined and, well, hardly subtle, but refined you can be in the use of your own language. You couldn't possibly do something like that if you were speaking in German, because one wouldn't know the German vernacular equivalent of hello, hello, hello.
Robert Lloyd singing Osmin in Mozart's Seraglio in German. The argument will of course continue, the original language or translation. There's a lot to be said on both sides. We've heard about the advantages of translation, how it helps us follow, which matters very much in comic opera, rather less in romantic melodramas like Il Trovatore. And it can help if you're coming to an opera knowing nothing about it. We've heard about the problems of translation. But there is one practical reason for having opera in the original. If you want to hear the handful of really top international singers, live or on record, you're almost certainly going to have to hear them in the original language, because most of them only learn their roles in the original language. It's not worth their while to relearn them in translation, maybe just for a few performances, after which they'll be jetting off again. So nowadays, most international houses give opera in the original, while the ensemble companies, like English National Opera and Scottish and Welsh Opera, tend to perform in translation. So here, to end with, from the English National Opera production, are the final moments of Act 2 of The Valkyrie, the second opera in Wagner's Ring Cycle. Wotan storms off after his rebellious daughter Brunhilde. But Brunhilde, where is the guilty one, he sings. Fearful is the fate I'll pronounce when she is caught in her flight. Norman Bailey was Wotan in Wagner's The Valkyrie, in English from the English National Opera production. And it's production in opera which will be the subject of the 6th and final programme.
Enjoying Opera was presented by Monty Haltrecht, and you can hear the final programme in the series on stage next week at the same time, 4:10. Enjoying Opera is produced by Daniel Snowman. Programme 6, On Stage.
Old Joe has gone fishing, and young Joe has gone fishing, and young Joe has gone fishing, and found them a shoal. Old Joe has gone fishing, and young Joe has gone fishing, and young Joe has gone fishing, and found them a shoal. Rowing in canoes, and in canoes, and in canoes. Rowing in canoes, and in canoes, and in canoes.
Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes, which takes us further into the 20th century, 1945, than anything we've had so far in this series, apart, that is, from snatches of popular song. Otherwise, there's only been Richard Strauss's Rosenkavalier of 1911. The reason is quite simple. Most of the works put on in an opera house are from the 19th century, together with Mozart and a scattering of others from earlier. A major fact of operatic life.
The difficulty about opera is that it's a very expensive form, and that the style in which most leading composers now write and have written for, 50 years perhaps, is a musical style that is not majority, that doesn't attract people. It can do, and masterpieces can come out of it, but they seem to come less often than they used to, certainly in the last century. That is a difficulty. So that there aren't enough works entering the repertory, and they don't enter it fast enough to make people think it's a living art.
As Lord Harwood says, the style of modern composers, and that's not just opera, but classical music generally, doesn't attract people. It's not just music either. In other forms, too, there's been something of a separation of the cultures in our century. A separation between highbrow and popular, which wasn't so much an issue for the great ones of the last century, whether it was Verdi in opera or Dickens in the novel. Some modern works manage to cross the line, but in the main, large audiences are attracted to the explicitly popular forms, the cinema, the musical, and some forms of television. So, in the absence of modern works with appeal, the opera house offers mostly old works. Now, does this matter?
I don't think that to work with masterpieces from the past which most repertory theatres, as opposed to commercial theatres, do, which symphony orchestras almost exclusively do. I don't think that the museum aspect of that means that it's dead in any way. I don't think people think of Shakespeare plays as dead. I don't think you feel, oh, we're in a museum, none of this quite speaks to us.
On the contrary, performing the great works of the past ought to be the main function of an opera house, like giving Shakespeare and the classics in the major repertory theatres. Great novels of the past are there on the library shelves. It's mostly the classics you go to the concert hall to hear, and the great operas ought to be available too. But what has happened to the operatic repertory in our century? Has it been expanded at all? Well, yes, it has. Benjamin Britten and Berg have added major works, and Richard Strauss was producing operas right up to the 40s. There are some 20th century works being performed. The works of the Czech composer Janacek, for example, have been given more and more often in recent years. Janacek's Katya Kabanova. If the operatic repertory has expanded a little, it's not only a matter of new works being added. Tastes change too. What was once out of fashion can become acceptable again. And not only in opera. In painting, for decades the pre-Raphaelites were out of fashion, and then suddenly they seemed to have something to say after all. Even Shakespeare, the so-called problem plays of his later years, Measure for Measure, Troilus and Cressida, were rarely performed until in the 1950s their peculiarly anti-heroic and anti-romantic strains gave them new appeal. And it's much the same in opera. Some of the more florid French repertory, Delibes' Lakmé, for example, and Gounod's Romeo and Juliet, went out of fashion at the end of the last century with the arrival of Verismo opera, that is to say, the more realistic school of Italian opera, composers like Puccini. There were now fewer singers about who had the vocal agility and technique for the French operas, and there were only occasional revivals. And there are certainly also some Russian operas by Rimsky-Korsakov and Borodin, among others, at the moment not very much performed outside Russia. The point is, any of these might be brought forward at any time, just as Mozart's Così fan tutte was after a century of neglect. And it does happen sometimes that a particular singer can revive a taste for works rarely performed, as Maria Callas did in the 50s with works of the early 19th century by Bellini and Donizetti, among others. And the operatic repertory has also been extended by going a great deal further back still, to take in some of the earliest operas of all. Elizabeth Söderström and Helen Donat in Monteverdi's Coronation of Poppaea of 1642, revived again in modern times after 3 centuries of virtual neglect. So the repertory has been extended a little. Most opera houses perform some modern works, and possibly earlier ones too, from the 18th and even 17th centuries. One way of bringing new works into the opera house is to expand the definition of opera. What about works like this? Fritz Wunderlich singing the popular operetta Der Betelstudent. France too has its operetta, especially Offenbach, and in England there's Gilbert and Sullivan. America has a rich tradition of musicals, old enough now to have its established classics. And there are major American composers, George Gershwin with Porgy and Bess, Leonard Bernstein with Candide, works which could be done in an opera house or in the commercial theatre. The boundaries are difficult to define. Music critic Alan Blythe, in an earlier programme, gave us a working definition. It's not opera, generally speaking, when the singers use microphones or when the orchestra isn't quite symphonic in scale. Something like West Side Story, then, is borderline.
Tonight, won't be just any night. Tonight there will be no morning star. Tonight, I'll see my love tonight, and for us, one will stop where they are. Today, the minutes seem like hours, the hours go so slowly, and still the sky is bright. Oh, moon, grow bright, and make this endless day, endless night.
Bernstein's West Side Story, maybe not opera, but certainly operatic. If you adopt a broad definition of opera, as Lord Harwood does, of course there are operas, and popular ones too, being written today.
They're called Evita and Jesus Christ Superstar, and they're written by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Sondheim and so on. They might have been written for singers, I mean classical singers as they used to be in the past, but they are operas without any doubt whatsoever. I mean, Sweeney Todd was an opera written by a classically trained composer.
Have charity towards the world, my pet.
Yes, yes, I know, my love.
We'll take the customers that we can get.
High born and low, my love.
We'll not discriminate great from small. No, we'll serve anyone, meaning anyone, and to anyone and all.
Stephen Sondheim's Sweeney Todd. Some intriguing orchestration, the vocal writing within the capacity of singers who haven't necessarily an operatic technique. And that could be a good thing from the composer's point of view. If you don't absolutely require opera singers, then of course the work is a great deal easier to cast and there are more possibilities for it. It can be done in the commercial theatre, 8 performances a week and a possible long run, and that doesn't preclude its being done in an opera house as well. Already, a great variety of works are performed in the opera house under the one roof, from the most serious and exalted works through to the frothiest of comic operas. One night you might get a Brunhilde at full stretch, and the next night, accompanied by the same orchestra, you might get a little maidservant in some comic opera, roguishly recommending that you don't take life too seriously. From Monteverdi's Coronation of Poppaea through to Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes represents a development through 3 centuries. And so, many would argue, why not go a little further in both time and musical style and take in Sondheim as well? Sweeney Todd may not need singers with an operatic technique, but there's no reason why an opera singer shouldn't sing in a popular musical. There are precedents.
Some enchanted evening, you may see a stranger, you may see a stranger across a crowded room, and somehow you know even then, that somewhere see her again and again.
When Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote South Pacific,
They had the great operatic bass Ezio Pinza specifically in mind. Opera or musical comedy? In a way, how you define a work hardly matters. You could consider anything an honorary opera once it's been performed on an opera stage.
I don't think that an opera company needs to be too stuck up about its self-definition and its self-regard.
John Cox, General Administrator of Scottish Opera.
And I think there will be a move now to broaden repertoire, and that will be absolutely consonant with the move to broaden audiences. So, you know, it is conceivable that Sondheim will be rubbing shoulders with Mozart and Wagner.
Conceivable, but it hasn't happened yet. And it won't be easy to get Andrew Lloyd Webber or Stephen Sondheim to compose fully fledged operas. So, with few new works coming into the opera house, where is the, call it novelty or expansion in opera? What are the latest trends and developments? Probably, above all, in the staging of operas, in production. The producer, the equivalent of the director in straight theatre, is nowadays a very important person in the opera house, on a level with the conductor. He's responsible for virtually everything you actually see on the stage. The setting. One of the first things the producer has to do is agree the designer, and they work together closely. Because the setting is more than just a stage picture or a background for the singers, it's the whole world the characters have to inhabit. It should define the atmosphere of the opera, the colour and tone of sets and costumes and the lighting, the relationships between the characters, the groupings, the way they move. There's a lot for the producer to think about, and he can make all the difference. Take Bizet's Carmen. When Carmen first appears among a crowd of men, they have eyes only for her, except for one, Don José. And of course, he's the only one she has eyes for. That's the action which the producer, in collaboration with the singers, has to reproduce. Now, Carmen is of course the star of the show, but she also has to be believable as a gypsy girl who works in a cigarette factory. She's got to fit in. She's got to stand out as well. She flaunts herself, but there mustn't be a single flounce or a hip swing too many, or they lose their effect. A complex scene, even if they were only speaking, but it's got to be sung. The crowd must be alive and moving, as a crowd does move, grouping and regrouping. They can't take their eyes off Carmen, but they have to watch the conductor as well, and so does she. Agnes Balza as Bizet's Carmen. There have been enormous advances in production techniques this century, in lighting, in stage machinery, and in production styles. But the innovators have worked in spoken theatre. Opera, a cumbersome form, has lagged behind. But since the war, more and more directors have been brought in from spoken theatre, from the cinema too, and they've had a profound effect on the presentation of opera. With so few new works entering the repertory, singers and conductors, on however exalted a level, are mostly confined to recreating familiar works. In a way, it's the producer who has more scope for original creation. In those familiar works in particular, he can on occasion go very far indeed.
Everybody in opera has seen Aida too many times now, especially the critics, and especially the directors. And so there is this kind of awful relationship, love-hate relationship between creative people and critics. And I think it afflicts directors particularly at the moment, and particularly in Germany, where they are a very strong breed and where the pickings are very rich. And the outcome of that is you approach a piece like Aida, and your first question is, I'm being very perverse now, why do I dislike this piece? And that leads you into doing it in a different way, which will make you like it. And that is the kind of authorial way in. You take hold of a piece and you use the material for your own ends as a thinker.
Aida, which John Cox mentions, is a good example. In the third act, Verdi uses miracles of orchestration to conjure up a beautiful moonlit night. And just as well he does, because evidently the producer doesn't always conjure it up on the stage.
I understand they're doing really crazy things, for example, of an Aida set in modern times in an office building or a factory or something, and a handful of sand on the floor for the Nile and things like that.
Soprano Marilyn Schau, who has sung in many of the leading opera houses in Germany. We were given a graphic description of this kind of production from the bass Robert Lloyd, who sang in a German production of another Verdi opera, The Force of Destiny, the scene where the officious and irascible Friar Melitone is feeding the poor. And The Force of Destiny, remember, is set in the 17th century.
In normal productions, he comes in with a big bowl of soup and he feeds the paupers who stand around. In this production, Melitone is having a dream, and in this dream, he's got a fantastic banquet in front of him. And the paupers are all coming around trying to snatch pieces off the table, and he's beating them off. Padre Guardiano comes on, that's me, his boss, his abbot, comes in and he says, you must have charity, and gives him a little ticking off. But then, when one of the paupers comes and touches Guardiano's leg, Guardiano shrinks away in disgust, and lest his very smart clerical suit should get dirtied by these creatures.
Already quite a departure from Verdi's original intention that Guardiano should be benign and dignified.
Then things get a little bit out of hand. The paupers begin to get noisy and angry, and the police come in and herd them up against a wall, and then the photographers come in and take photographs of this exciting situation, and at each flash of the bulb from the photographers' lamps, the people against the wall convulse as though they'd been shot by a machine gun, and so they adopt the attitudes of those people being shot in the Hungarian uprising. You know, those famous photographs of the people actually being shot. They adopt these attitudes and then fall to the ground and then stand up again and are photographed again and shot again. And you get these spasms of convulsive movement from the extras who are playing the part of the crowd.
An extreme example, but in line with what you can now see quite often in the Straight Theatre too. But it is true to say that audiences there have become accustomed to experiment over something like a quarter of a century, to seeing plays set in a new context. A Shakespeare play set in Mussolini's Italy, it might be, or Freud's Vienna, or Edwardian England. And familiar characters can be startlingly reinterpreted, no end to the possibilities. In opera, the day might not be too far off when, say, Puccini's La Bohème, for most of us the very embodiment of young love and its raptures, will be so twisted that Mimi becomes a calculating little tart. One advantage opera has over straight theatre. If a Shakespeare play is set in modern times, the actors can maybe slouch about in the modern manner and mumble. In opera, you always have the music, and you can't get away from it. You can mumble Hamlet's to be or not to be in a modern dress production, but you can't mumble La Donna Mobile. And obviously, not all productions go to extremes. Admittedly, the ones that do often attract a great deal of attention. They can be inflammatory talking points. But ambitious modern operatic productions, even the best of them, and not necessarily way-out ones, can be a little bit nerve-wracking to watch sometimes, and certainly nerve-wracking to perform in. A Covent Garden production of Wagner's Ring Cycle was based on a huge and often dangerously tilting and rotating platform. Robert Lloyd was one of the two giants in Rheingold, and he told us about the costumes the two of them had to wear.
They were built really on the principle of a vacuum flask. They were in fact stuffed with whatever the stuff is called, kapok, to make bulk, and sealed top and bottom. And we had spaceman's helmets, which kept the heat in. We had huge boots, which were something like 12 inches thick, to give us height. And the effect of moving even a very short distance in these costumes was to generate an enormous amount of sweat. So that at the end of the first scene, we would go to the dressing rooms and open the costumes, and clouds of steam would come out of the costume. And to perform in those costumes is one thing, and it's not desirable, but it's possible. But to rehearse in them is an entirely different thing. And in fact, there was a serious accident at one of the rehearsals in one of those costumes. One of the singers missed his footing and severed his Achilles tendon.
Hard on the singers, certainly. But it was an effective production in many ways, and not so very way out as modern productions go. In fact, many of today's most imaginative productions penetrate very deeply into the work, with the scenic and dramatic elements unified to make a satisfying whole. Production firmly rooted in the work itself, and not bringing in considerations, political or psychological, which are foreign to it. Alan Blythe, who's seen productions of all kinds, both in Britain and abroad, is prepared to give credit where it's due.
I'm thinking of Peter Hall with his work at Glyndebourne, where he's gone back and said, well, he's been humble before the work. He said, what is this opera about? And what do you, the singers that is, think it's about? And let us think it out anew. And if you do that, then you get, it seems to me, a completely new look on the work, which is absolutely faithful to the score. And there have been further examples of this in Jonathan Miller's work. I think even his production of Rigoletto, which updated it to 1950s New York, did work because the story was kept quite intact and marched very well with the music.
John Cox would have approved that assessment. He's not only in charge of Scottish opera, but he's also one of Britain's most distinguished opera producers.
I can only tackle a piece as if it was new. And actually, when I do tackle a piece, it is usually pretty new to me. Some mischievous colleague of mine once said, yes, it's well known that you only know the pieces that you've ever directed, which is okay. I am not an opera buff as such. I do not spend hours and hours listening to records which I know I'm never going to direct. I have my particular favourites, obviously, and I do spend a lot of time listening to opera, but I don't start thinking about it creatively until I actually have to do it creatively.
Maybe you still think of opera as rather specialised, for the initiated, not John Cox's attitude.
My approach to it is, there will be a lot of people in the audience who will be seeing this also for the first time, and it will be new to them.
John Cox, in fact, has no doubt that opera is at last really coming into the public domain.
No doubt at all. I mean, look at the evidence. The percentage rise in the purchase of seats available over the last 10 years has been, in opera, has been something like from 60% to 84%. Opera is a boom business.
Sometimes, of course, it doesn't work. You get slack conducting, fat and faltering prima donnas, stodgy productions. The performance clumps along depressingly. It can happen. But as I've tried to suggest in this series, opera can appeal on a deep level. It can provide an outlet for emotions which are rarely touched. It can be funny, thrilling, uplifting. And it's the great performance. It doesn't happen often, but once you've been lucky and you've experienced it, that's what you hope for. That's what sends you back to the opera house again and again, hoping for another performance like that one you're never going to forget. It's why you feel yourself going tense when the lights are lowered, and the orchestra strikes up, and the curtain rises. That's how it is for me, anyway. That's when you respond to the enthusiasm of the clown in Pagliacci, inviting the audience in, the curtains going up, come in and enjoy the show.
Andiamo,
Enjoying Opera was presented by Monty Haltrecht and produced by Daniel Snowman. The series consultant was Alan Blythe. And you would like to know that the series Enjoying Opera will be repeated on Radio 4 VHF starting next Tuesday evening at 11 o'clock.